Hi again. We're in James Orr chapter 2, Sidelights on Christian Doctrine. James Orr was Presbyterian, but we need to establish right off the bat in talking about the attributes of God, which we're doing for the next few videos. Those attributes are attributes unanimously agreed upon by Christian theologians through the ages. So James Orr, as he writes this, is not expressing his opinion, either as a man or as a Presbyterian. These are the attributes of God agreed upon by the big 9 denominations. And just in case you don't know what I mean by that, the 9 principal Christian denominations, counting numerically, that is, by numbers of adherents, would be the Catholics, the Orthodox, the Anglicans, the Lutherans, the Reformed, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and the Baptists, and the Pentecostals. Now there's many more denominations, but these are the most influential. Now they all agree on the attributes of God, as against the views of God that promulgate among the other ancient religions and all modern religions, including the cults. So we can't take this subject for granted, as many Christians do, as being self-evident truths about God. So we're going to start into the attributes of God now. Orr says, turning now to the divine attributes, we have found that most of these attributes, unity, power, eternity, unchangeableness, etc., are already implied in the signification of the divine names, but a nearer study is desirable. By attributes of God are meant not anything distinct from God himself or divisions of his essence, but simply those determinations of his being and character which are implied in his relations to the world and man, and which our thought must distinguish without implying that they are really separable from him or from one another. The attributes have been conveniently distinguished as natural and moral. A mere philosophical distinction is into those which belong generally to God's being as the absolute one, that is, his self-existence, eternity, infinity, and the like. Those which belong to his being as personal, spirituality, personality, freedom, and the specific attributes divided as before into natural and moral. Let no one take fright at the word absolute as applied to God. When philosophy speaks of God as the absolute one, it means only what Scripture everywhere implies. That is, that God's is that existence which, unlike every other, is in and of itself, dependent solely on itself, gives its being and law to all other existence, but it itself is conditioned by none. God is one, sole, living, self-existent sovereign. God is the absolute one, is sovereign, but care must be taken not to attach false ideas to this much abused term. The sovereignty of God does not mean that the will of God is an arbitrary will. Even Calvin declares that God is not ex lex, that is arbitrary, but that it is a will self-determined, not prescribed to or controlled from without, a will which has its last grounds of acting in itself. First, self-existence, which we attribute to God in this connection, is not a thought which it is left to our own choice to form. We cannot admit existence at all without being compelled to go back finally on some uncaused, necessary, self-existent being. God, for our faith, is that being. He is unoriginated, uncaused, self-existent, necessary. Scripture constantly assumes this to be true of God. It never thinks of God as the Babylonians thought of their deities, that is, having been born or having had a beginning. On the other hand, he is the free creator and disposer of all that exists. He must therefore, as Christ says, have life in himself. That be John 5, verse 26. Second, the first truth about God involves others. For plainly, the self-existent one must be the ever-existent, that is, the eternal. The author and disposer of all things can be limited by nothing beyond himself, save as he himself establishes the limits. Therefore must be unlimited or infinite. Infinity is an abstract idea the Bible writers perhaps did not entertain, but it is obvious from their teachings that the perfections of God had no limits set to them in their thoughts. Still, it is well to remember that we are here in presence of great mysteries, and that in attributing eternity and infinity to God, we employ terms which largely outreach our means of positive conception and drive us back upon the use of symbols. The form in which the Scripture represents God's eternity to us is that of duration through endless ages. From everlasting to everlasting, literally from age to age, thou art God, according to Psalm 90, verse 2. In the New Testament, we have unto the ages of the ages. That's Ephesians 3:20. Ordinarily, we think of God's eternity in the same manner, as duration infinitely prolonged in the two directions of time, backwards and forwards. Yet this is only a symbol for what really transcends time. Time, strictly, has relation to a world of objects existing in succession. God fills time. It is in every part of it, but his eternity still is not really this being in time. It is rather that to which being in time forms a contrast. Here, thought fails. This relation of the eternity of God to time is, in truth, one of the most difficult problems in theology, probably with our present faculties, an insoluble one. It is not otherwise with infinity. The symbol here usually employed is boundlessness, a quantitative conception. When reflection is applied to the subject, however, it is easy to see that there can never be a realized quantitative infinitude. If it ever was realized, it would not be infinite. The infinitude of number, for instance, does not lie in an infinite series ever being realized, but in the potentiality in number of going on forever. Omnipotence in God does not mean an absolute quantum of power, but an exhaustless potency of power, a possibility in the exercise of power to which no limits can be set. A power which can do everything, which is a possibility of power, and that endlessly. This is still plainer in the moral perfections. Infinite holiness or love is not a boundless quantum of holiness or of love, but a holiness and love which qualitatively are free from all limitation and defect. Perhaps we may say that infinity in God is ultimately A, internally and qualitatively, absence of all limitation and defect, and B, boundless potentiality. 3. From the same character of absoluteness flows God's immutability. He abideth faithful. He cannot deny himself, according to 2 Timothy 2:13. This changelessness of God, it need hardly be said, is not to be confounded with immobility or rigid fixity in one unbending course of action. It does not exclude infinite variety in means and methods, the many-colored wisdom of which Paul speaks in Ephesians 3, verse 10. It is oneness in purpose, principle, character, aim, the negation of vacillation, inconsistency, fickleness, and caprice. So in the next section on the attributes of God, we'll deal with God as spirit, but not impersonal spirit, the God of the philosophers, but personal. And also the three omnis, omnipresence, omniscience, and omnipotence, the classical attributes of God, which all in one form or another are denied by the cults and by other major religions. We'll also put a link on your screen to the Watchtower God versus the God of David, a meditation on Psalm 139. And next time, God the personal spirit.